It was a crisp October morning in the quiet town of Duskfield. The kind of town where people still left their front doors unlocked, where Sunday church bells echoed through cobblestone streets, and nothing ever seemed to go wrong, until it did. At Duskfield Academy, a private boarding school nestled between thick woods and old stone walls, the day began like any other. Students in pressed uniforms filed into classrooms. Teachers sipped lukewarm coffee, and the smell of freshly waxed floors filled the air. But at precisely 10:02 a.m., the fire alarm blared, part of a routine fire drill scheduled months in advance. Teachers ushered their students outside in calm lines, clipboards in hand. In the sea of uniforms stood Isla and Isaac Rivers, 12-year-old fraternal twins, inseparable since birth. Isla with her messy braid and quiet confidence, Isaac with his sketchbook and nervous smile. The two held hands as they followed their class out through the south exit, chatting softly, barely audible over the siren. They were both marked present at roll call. 10 minutes later, they were gone. At first, it was written off as confusion. Maybe they had slipped away to the bathroom or wandered into the wrong group. But when their names were called again and no answer came, something shifted in the air. Teachers glanced at each other nervously. A second roll call, then a third. Still no twins. Panic began to ripple. A headmistress shouted for all staff to double-check the premises. Students were reassembled, counted again. But Isla and Isaac were nowhere to be found. Inside the security room, grainy footage showed them walking together down the rear hallway near the science wing. Then static. The screen glitched for exactly 8 minutes. When the feed returned, the hallway was empty. 8 minutes. No footage of them leaving the building. No back door opened. No alarms triggered. Nothing. The campus went into lockdown. The Duskfield Police Department arrived within 30 minutes. Bloodhounds were brought in to comb the nearby woods. Helicopters circled above, but the dogs lost the twins scent near the rear courtyard, just a few feet from a bricked-up entrance no longer in use. The building's original blueprints labeled it as access to the old service tunnels, abandoned since the 1960s. There was more. Inside the basement, a janitor named Harold Beeks was found unconscious, slumped against a storage closet door. A knot on his forehead, bleeding slightly. When revived, he was disoriented and claimed someone had struck him from behind. He remembered hearing a shuffle, then two voices, and the click of a lock before blacking out. In the control room, investigators noticed that the fire alarm system had been manually tripped, not from the main console, but from a switch box near the boiler room. That was the first red flag, and it wouldn't be the last. Within 48 hours, search efforts ballooned. News helicopters hovered over Duskfield. Reporters from neighboring cities parked outside the school gates. Dozens of volunteers combed through the woods. Divers searched the nearby reservoir. A $100,000 reward was posted. But there were no footprints, no eyewitnesses, and no exit route. The only physical evidence: 2 pairs of school shoes, Isla's and Isaac's, found neatly placed side by side near the bricked-up service tunnel. Laura and Michael Rivers were both broken in different ways. Michael turned inward, obsessed with combing through every second of security footage, every secondhand lead. Laura went public, appearing on every news program that would have her, pleading for answers. The school board, desperate to contain the fallout, hired a private PR firm. Press conferences were scripted. No wrongdoing. No negligence. The safety of our students remains our top priority. But behind the scenes, strange details began to surface. A week after the disappearance, a substitute teacher reported that one of her students claimed to have heard screams from below the gym a few weeks before the fire drill. When questioned, the boy said, "It was like a girl yelling. Then it just stopped." His story was dismissed as imagination, but it planted doubt. Investigators returned to Isla and Isaac's shared dorm room. Everything was still in place. Beds made, books stacked, drawings taped to the walls. But one thing was missing: a framed family photo the twins always kept on their bedside table. Gone. Not shattered. Not fallen. Just gone. Michael swore it had been there during move-in week. More unsettling still, a second security tape, previously overlooked, showed a figure trailing the twins as they exited the science wing during the drill. The figure was tall, wore a faculty jacket, and kept a distance of about 10 feet. The camera caught just a shoulder and hand, then glitched again. The person was never identified. The school claimed no staff member matched the build or timing. And so, Duskfield Academy sealed its records. The fire drill was scrubbed from its website. The tunnels were re-cemented. And the twins' case went cold. But a question lingered in every corridor, whispered among the students who stayed and the parents who left. How can two children disappear into smoke without leaving a trace? 20 years is a long time. Long enough for trees to grow where playgrounds once stood. Long enough for classmates to forget names. And long enough for a wound, even one as deep as losing two children, to scab over without ever truly healing. The once scandalized Duskfield Academy had rebranded itself as Duskfield Preparatory, leaning into glossy advertisements and alumni donations to bury its troubled past. New buildings were constructed, uniforms redesigned, faculty quietly replaced. What remained of the old brick structures were framed as heritage wings, cleaned, whitewashed, and free of their ghosts. The disappearance of Isla and Isaac Rivers had faded into legend, a cautionary tale told in whispers by upperclassmen to new students. Some said the twins ran away. Others believed they were taken by someone in the woods. A few claimed to hear crying at night near the gymnasium walls, but no one dared investigate. It was easier to forget, more comfortable that way. But Michael Rivers never forgot, while his wife Laura had tried. For a while, the weight of unanswered questions had slowly eroded their marriage. First came the silence, then the resentment, then the move. Laura packed her things one rainy afternoon, whispering only, "I can't mourn the same day forever," before boarding a flight to Oregon. Within a year, she had remarried, a software developer named Greg, who spoke in calm, rational sentences and hated bringing up the past. Michael stayed behind in Duskfield. He rented a small cottage not far from the school's perimeter and dedicated the rest of his life to a blog called Vanished Ashes, a deep-dive archive of unsolved disappearances, cold case theories, and above all, the mystery of his children. He wasn't just a grieving father anymore. He was a conspiracy theorist, obsessed, alone, obsessively combing forums and blueprints. He had posted thousands of pages of handwritten notes, security frame analyses, faculty records, and even FOIA requests from local authorities. Most dismissed him. Others sent tips, some helpful, many not. He became infamous in niche internet corners as the Duskfield Dad. Still, nothing ever came close to real closure. Until she called. Gwen Coker, a name Michael hadn't heard in over a decade. She was one of the last people to see Isla and Isaac that day. A classmate. Now, a rising investigative podcaster known for digging up the secrets elite institutions hoped would stay buried. Her message was brief. "Michael, it's Gwen. I'm doing a series on unsolved school disappearances. I want to reopen Duskfield. No gatekeeping, just the truth. Can we meet?" They met 2 days later in a coffee shop near campus. Gwen, now in her early 30s, had the same sharp eyes she had as a child, though now more hardened. She wore a backpack full of notes and a recorder clipped to her collar. Michael was hesitant. He had turned down dozens of reporters over the years. But Gwen wasn't a stranger. She was one of the few kids who had spoken at the memorial service, who had cried when Isla's bed was stripped. Gwen was serious. "I'm not here to make you look crazy. I'm here because I think you're not." She revealed she had tracked down a handful of former staff members who'd left Duskfield under suspicious circumstances. One refused to speak. Another hinted off the record that not all staff followed the student safety protocol during drills. She planned to release the podcast in 5 parts, the final one reserved for any new developments. "If there's anything new," Gwen said, "I'll help bring it to light." Michael agreed. He gave her access to his blog's back-end archives, decades of notes, and more. He finally felt like he wasn't shouting into the void. And then, just as their collaboration began, the postcard arrived. It came in a plain white envelope. No return address. The stamp was postmarked from Maple Bay, a small, sleepy coastal town several hours east of Duskfield, a place with no direct connection to the case. Michael nearly threw it away, assuming it was another crank letter. But something about the weight, the texture of the envelope, made him pause. Inside, a single postcard. On the front, a faded photograph of Duskfield Academy, the old school building, back before renovations, before the new crest, before time tried to erase its sins. Michael's hands trembled as he flipped it over. On the back, written in smudged black ink, were 6 words. I am alive. It's me. I. Michael sat frozen for nearly a full minute. His eyes blurred with tears, his mouth dry. Isaac, he whispered aloud. It didn't seem real. It couldn't be. He dropped the postcard, picked it up again, inspected the stamp, the postmark, the handwriting. It was sloppy, almost rushed, but unmistakably childlike in a way. A part of him knew, felt it. This was no hoax. The next morning, he took it to the police. They were skeptical at first. A 20-year-old cold case? A cryptic postcard? But Michael insisted on DNA testing. He'd sent in his own DNA to multiple genealogy databases over the years. He knew what would come next. A week later, the results came in. The DNA on the stamp matched. It was Isaac Rivers. Alive. News spread fast. Michael, against Gwen's advice, uploaded the scanned postcard to Vanished Ashes with a single caption. He's out there. My son is alive. The blog exploded. True crime forums lit up. National podcasts picked up the story. Commenters speculated whether Isaac had escaped a kidnapping, had been in hiding, or was part of some government cover-up. Everyone had a theory. Everyone wanted answers. Then, 3 days later, Michael's house was broken into. Nothing was stolen. No money, no electronics. The drawers in his study were torn open. His computer tower was left humming. But the original postcard? Gone. The frame he had placed it in was shattered. Glass scattered across his desk. And on his office chair, a single glove, rubber, pale, discarded. The police came, took photos, but found no fingerprints. No forced entry. No suspect. Michael wasn't shocked. They don't want him found, he told Gwen. Someone knows where he is, and they're terrified he'll talk. Luckily, Michael had scanned the postcard the night he received it. The image, along with the stamp, postmark, and ink blotches, were all digitized and uploaded across multiple servers. They can take the paper, he said, but they can't erase the proof. The case was reopened, and this time, it wasn't just the Duskfield Police Department involved. The FBI stepped in, citing the interstate nature of the postcard and the sudden disappearance of a presumed dead minor. But Isaac didn't surface again, at least not yet. And as Gwen's podcast prepared to release episode 1, The Drill, listeners were left with one question pulsing louder than ever before. Where had Isaac been for 20 years? And what did he see that someone still wants to hide? The closer Gwen and Michael came to the truth, the more the school resisted. Officially, Duskfield Academy had moved on. The old bricks were polished, the scandal erased. But memory is like mold. It grows in hidden places, and sometimes, all it takes is a scratch in the paint to reveal the rot underneath. Gwen had spent the last 2 weeks combing through old staff rosters, archival news articles, and blueprints buried in the town's zoning office. She discovered that the Duskfield Gymnasium, built in the early 1960s, sat on top of an older foundation, one marked in faded ink as CBP on the original school schematics. Correctional Behavioral Ethics Program, Gwen whispered, scanning the documents. Never listed publicly. Never spoken of again after 1978. Michael sat beside her, silent. That name meant nothing to him yet, but he could feel it. This was what he had been circling for years. Something hidden. Something designed to stay buried. The next morning, they met with Mrs. Edna Maris, a retired kitchen worker from the 1980s who now lived in assisted care outside Duskfield. At first, she was cautious. Decades of silence weighed on her. But when Gwen showed her the postcard Isaac had sent, Edna's hands trembled. That poor boy, she murmured. I thought they got rid of all of them after the fire drill. Gwen leaned in. What do you mean them? Edna lowered her voice. Troubled students. The ones that didn't fit. They were sent down. Into the wing beneath the gym. It wasn't punishment, not officially. But they called it the quiet hall. No windows. Just concrete. I was told not to ask questions when meals went missing. But once, I heard a girl screaming. It stopped so suddenly. Like someone shut off the air. Michael swallowed hard. Do you know how to get down there? Edna nodded slowly. Through the equipment closet behind the gym bleachers. There's a false panel. But after the Rivers twins vanished, they sealed it shut and re-bricked it. Like it never existed. It was past midnight when Gwen and Michael returned to the school. She had a set of old blueprints. He had a crowbar and a flashlight. Security patrols had shifted since the new renovations, but the gymnasium remained mostly unchanged after hours. They slipped through a side door and crept behind the faded maroon bleachers. Dust clung to the air. The wall looked solid, but Gwen knocked softly. Hollow. They pulled back a rolling shelf stacked with old mats. Gwen pried at the drywall seam while Michael chipped away with the crowbar. After 10 tense minutes, a panel gave way. Behind it, a narrow iron stairwell led downward into darkness. The smell hit them first: old mildew, rot, and something metallic buried deep in the concrete. This wasn't just storage, Gwen whispered. This was confinement. They descended slowly, the flashlight beam dancing over stained concrete walls. At the bottom, a corridor lined with 6 narrow doors. Heavy locks. No windows. No sound. Room by room, they uncovered remnants of something sinister. One cell had moldy bedding on a rusted cot. The walls were scratched with markings, small, repetitive dashes. Hundreds of them. Another had a broken sink and a rusted chair bolted to the floor, straps still attached. But it was the third room that stopped Michael in his tracks. A pair of small glasses lay on the floor, cracked but intact. These were Isaac's, he whispered. He had these the week before the drill. We got them fitted together. Gwen knelt beside him and picked them up, carefully wrapping them in cloth. She looked around the room, scanning the ceiling, then the corners. Her flashlight landed on something charred, a burned wooden plank wedged into the wall. She pried it loose and turned it over. Carved into the blackened wood were 4 letters and 2 numbers, scrawled in jagged childlike lines. Isla 1 of 17. The date of the fire drill. She was down here, Gwen whispered. She carved this before whatever happened. Michael turned away, his face tightening. His fingers gripped the flashlight until his knuckles went white. We have to keep going. At the far end of the hall was a door different from the others, steel, with reinforced edges. It took both of them to pull it open, the rust screaming as it moved. Inside was what looked like a supply room, at first. Stacks of boxes, a fallen chair, a blanket. But Gwen spotted something behind a cracked wall panel, a faint seam in the concrete, discolored from the rest. She pressed on it. Nothing. Michael joined her, using the crowbar. The panel cracked, and behind it, a narrow cavity. Too narrow to see much, but large enough to hide something. Gwen reached in with gloved hands and pulled. First came cloth, then hair, then something dry, fragile, a human arm. They didn't scream. They didn't speak. They called the police from outside the building, using Gwen's secure line. By dawn, the Duskfield forensics unit had secured the scene. Cadaver dogs were brought in. The cavity was excavated. A full human skeleton, partially preserved, had been wedged behind the panel, intentionally hidden. A child's remains. Dental records came back 3 days later. It was Isla Rivers. The discovery made national headlines. Remains found in Duskfield Academy basement confirmed as missing twin. Father's 20-year fight for truth leads to break in cold case. The school was forced to issue a statement. Investigations were reopened. Families of other former students began calling journalists. The Correctional Behavioral Ethics Program, once a ghost story, was now very real. But Michael didn't feel relief. He felt hollow. We found her, he said. But that means Isaac saw it all. He lived through it. And somewhere out there, Isaac was still running from it. The coordinates in Isaac's note led to a gray, wind-choked corner of the coast called Marrow Bay, a town that didn't show up on most GPS maps, where time seemed to slow and cell signals died near the shore. Michael and Gwen arrived by bus and checked into a roadside inn, the kind where the wallpaper curled at the corners and every lamp buzzed slightly when turned on. The woman at the front desk stared too long at Michael's last name, but said nothing. He was used to that. They waited for 2 days before Isaac contacted them. A knock at the motel room door at 11:37 p.m. He had changed. Gone was the soft-spoken boy with round glasses and a crooked smile. The man who stood before them had hollowed cheeks, unshaved stubble, and eyes that flicked to the corners of the room every few seconds. He wore layers, 3 of them, despite the summer heat. "You weren't followed?" he asked, his voice strained. "No," Gwen replied. "We made sure." He nodded and stepped inside, locking the door behind him with shaking hands. Isaac Rivers had spent the last 20 years running from ghosts. But tonight, he had finally stopped, just long enough to be heard. "It wasn't a drill," Isaac began, his voice almost a whisper. "It was planned. All of it." He told them what really happened on January 17th. The morning had started like any other. He and Isla had gone to class, eaten breakfast, joked about skipping gym later that day. Then the alarm rang. They followed the evacuation line like everyone else. But when they reached the rear hallway, Dr. Heron, the school psychologist, was waiting for them. She said we had to go a different way, Isaac recalled. Said there was a safety issue. We trusted her. They followed her down a side corridor. Two other staff members, Mr. Daly and Nurse Corrin, were waiting near the hidden stairwell. They guided the twins below ground, into the so-called quiet hall. When Isla began to protest, Heron told them something Isaac would never forget. Your minds are unclean. You've been influenced. We're going to fix you. The door slammed shut behind them. For days, the twins were kept in separate cells. They were given stale food and water, spoken to only through a metal grate. Heron would visit with a notebook, asking questions that made no sense. Have you heard voices? Do you question the rules? Would you tell someone if a teacher made you uncomfortable? Would you sacrifice yourself to protect a lie? Isaac didn't understand any of it. But Isla fought. She told them it was illegal, told them our parents would find us, told them they were sick. That's when the abuse began. They were told they were corrupted, that their bond as twins was unnatural, and that Isla had a rebellious spirit that needed to be broken. One night, after days of psychological torment, food deprivation, and blinding lights during sleep, Isla screamed for hours. Then one night, her screams stopped. They told me she got what she deserved, Isaac said, staring at the floor. I never saw her again. He tried asking questions, begged to be moved, threatened to scream. But every time, he was given sedatives. One day, he woke up in a different place, a facility with no name, no school crest, just plain walls and adults who never answered questions. There were other kids there, all with vacant eyes. They called it a reform home, told me I was being rehabilitated. My name was changed to David. I was taught to say I had no siblings, no parents, no past. If he disobeyed, they took away meals or locked him in the white box, a room with no sound, no light, just time. He was moved again when he turned 14, this time to a halfway home for troubled teens, then foster care under a false file. At every stage, the paperwork was forged, the records falsified. They made sure no one would connect the dots, that no one would ask why a boy with no records before age 12 suddenly appeared in the system. He didn't speak his real name for 10 years, until he found the old postcard, one he and Isla had mailed home from a field trip in 3rd grade. It had ended up in a thrift store bin. When he saw it, the memory came flooding back. That was when I knew who I really was. Isaac Rivers, son of Michael and Laura, brother of Isla. But I didn't know if anyone else was alive, or if they even cared. He tracked down Michael's blog, saw the photos, the theories, the pain. That's when he sent the postcard from Marrow Bay. I didn't know if it would bring hope, Isaac said, or danger. Turns out it brought both. Gwen leaned forward. Isaac, were there other kids like you? Other disappearances? He hesitated, then nodded. Yes, before us and after. He remembered a girl named Mina, 11, who cried constantly for her parents and disappeared one morning without a trace. Another boy, Leo, who had a stutter and often wet the bed. He was removed after an outburst and never came back. They didn't want kids who questioned authority, or showed signs of mental health issues, or made the school look bad. They weren't fixing us. They were erasing us. Michael's hands were trembling. You're saying Duskfield ran a secret, behavioral cleansing program? Isaac nodded. The CBP wasn't just abandoned. It was used for decades after. Off the books. Quietly. Whenever they needed to make a problem disappear. Gwen reached for her recorder. This will blow open everything. But Isaac grabbed her hand. If you publish this, people will die. These aren't just teachers. They had people in child services, police, maybe even state government. A heavy silence filled the room. You want justice, Isaac whispered. But you'll have to burn down more than just a school. The deeper Gwen dug, the more dangerous it became to keep going. It started with a name, Dr. Evelyn Heron, the psychologist who led Isaac and Isla into the tunnels that day. Gwen traced her employment history across multiple elite prep schools and reform academies across the state. Most of her transitions came quietly, between school terms, with no public notices or announcements. But with the help of a contact in the legal system, Gwen got access to something more damning. Court-sealed guardianship transfers, dozens of them, over a span of 15 years. They were filed under emergency psychiatric interventions, fast-tracked through family court with little to no parental involvement. Some parents were unaware. Others were coerced. The pattern was chilling. Problematic students with minor behavioral issues, ADHD, stuttering, oppositional defiance, trauma-related outbursts, would vanish from normal schools and reappear in secluded reform programs. Then they'd drop off the map entirely. Buried in one file, Gwen found a line that turned her stomach. Transferred to Harmony Initiative Program, alternate facility. No further record. She recognized the name. Isaac's final stop before becoming David. Then came the break Gwen didn't expect. A retired nurse named Camilla Yorn, who had worked for 2 years at one such reform program, before resigning without explanation, contacted her after hearing the podcast teaser. Camilla agreed to a private interview. Voice only, location withheld. Her voice trembled as she spoke. They drugged the kids daily. Lithium, chlorpromazine, diazepam, and none of them had prescriptions. If a child resisted the sessions, they'd be sent to isolation. No sound, no windows, sometimes for days. Gwen asked what the sessions entailed. Behavioral cleansing. That's what they called it. Flashing lights, sound loops, repeating phrases. They said they were reprogramming trauma, but it was punishment. Some kids came back silent. Some never came back at all. She remembered one boy in particular. Quiet, small, with thick glasses. He didn't talk much, just stared out the window. But every time we made eye contact, I saw something, like he was trapped in his own body. Isaac. Camilla left after she found a child sedated and forgotten in a locked closet overnight. She submitted an internal report, which mysteriously disappeared. She was paid severance and signed a non-disclosure agreement under threat of losing her nursing license. It was a machine, she said, and Heron was just one gear in it. What Gwen discovered next made her blood run cold. Dr. Heron wasn't working alone. One of the faculty members who had assisted in transfers had been promoted to state superintendent of charter education, with authority over background checks, licensing, and regional audits. His name was Alan Reeve, and he had quietly erased nearly every paper trail connected to the old CBP initiative. Now, he was threatening Gwen with a lawsuit. She received a cease and desist letter stamped with official state seals, claiming defamation, unauthorized use of sensitive juvenile records, and potential endangerment of public trust. You continue this podcast, it read, and we will bring the full weight of the law against you. But Gwen didn't stop. Instead, she and Michael prepared their counterattack. On July 17th, 20 years to the day since the fire drill, Michael Rivers went live. He uploaded everything to a public cloud repository titled Duskfield Files, What Happened to the Missing Children. It included photos of Isla's recovered remains and coordinates of the secret basement. Isaac's audio testimony, time-stamped and signed with notarized affidavits. Scans of the blueprints revealing the hidden CBP wing. Court-sealed documents obtained through leaks. Gwen's interview with Nurse Camilla, voice disguised but verified. The download link was embedded on Vanished Ashes, cross-posted to major true crime subreddits, Reddit, Twitter, TikTok, and mirrored on multiple dark web forums to prevent takedown. Within hours, it had over 2.7 million downloads. The internet exploded. Hashtag Justice for Isla trended for days. But the truth has a cost. That same night, Alan Reeves' car exploded in a quiet suburb just outside the capital. Neighbors said they heard a strange pop, then fire. He'd been inside. Authorities quickly labeled it an accidental engine fire. But Gwen noticed something strange. All surveillance cameras on that block went dark for 3 minutes just before the explosion, exactly like the footage glitched during the Duskfield fire drill. Coincidence? Hardly. It wasn't the first time someone had been silenced. The moment the Duskfield files hit the public domain, the world couldn't look away. What had once been written off as a tragic mystery in a forgotten town was now the center of a national firestorm. News anchors called it the most disturbing child abuse scandal since Penhast. The footage of Isla's remains, the hidden rooms, the first-hand testimony from Isaac Rivers, the recordings of former staff, the psychiatric reform documents. Within 48 hours, Gwen's investigation was front-page news on The Times, Vox, The Intercept, and true crime podcasts worldwide. Every detail felt worse than the last. And finally, people with real power began to listen. The Department of Education, the FBI, and the Office of the Inspector General launched a multi-agency federal probe into Duskfield Academy and its affiliated reform programs. Within days, warrants were executed. Dr. Evelyn Herron, the woman who once held children in underground silence, was arrested at a private medical retreat in Oregon. Her face appeared on national television in handcuffs, aged but expressionless. She was charged with conspiracy to commit abduction, murder, illegal imprisonment of minors, and systemic abuse under color of authority. She pled not guilty, but she would never see the moon again. Dr. Evelyn Herron was sentenced to death by electrocution. Investigators began digging through old files, uncovering at least 9 other children who had vanished or transferred under mysterious circumstances from 1989 to 2006. 3 had never been accounted for. 2 were found buried on old campus grounds, previously marked as storage expansion zones. The country was stunned. The investigation snowballed. Several former board members of Duskfield Academy were charged with complicity after records revealed they'd authorized quiet payouts to families whose children had complained about unusual punishments before being moved. More horrifying, whistleblowers came forward from child services, claiming file tampering and forced removals had been conducted under pressure from education compliance liaisons tied to state contracts. Contracts influenced by now-deceased Superintendent Alan Reeve. The rot was deeper than anyone imagined. But thanks to Gwen and Michael's persistence and Isaac's bravery, it had finally been dragged into the light. The state permanently shuttered what remained of the Duskfield Academy campus. Within a year, construction began on something new. The Isla Rivers Center for Child Protection and Advocacy, a child-focused legal aid and trauma-informed education center. The site was transformed into a sanctuary for truth, not silence. At the dedication ceremony, flowers bloomed beside the freshly laid stone steps. Reporters gathered quietly as families, survivors, and advocates filled rows of white chairs under the summer sky. At the podium stood Isaac Rivers, no longer hidden. He wore a black suit, his hair neatly parted. His hands shook slightly as he unfolded the note from his jacket pocket. He didn't read from it. He looked out at the crowd. Then he spoke. "When I was 12, I watched my sister scream into darkness, and no one came. When I got out, I thought if I stayed quiet, I could survive. But silence doesn't heal. It corrodes." A pause. Cameras clicked, but no one interrupted. "I sent that postcard because I needed someone to believe me. Not just for me, but for her." He turned slightly, gesturing to a marble plaque under the entrance arch. "In memory of Isla Rivers, the girl who fought back." The crowd stood in silence. Then applause erupted, not for the tragedy, but for the courage, for the reckoning, for the change finally beginning to take root. Months later, Gwen released her multi-part documentary series titled Beneath the Bell, The Duskfield Scandal. The series featured everything: raw audio of Isaac's first interview, reconstructions of the sub-basement, whistleblower testimony from former nurses, teachers, and inspectors, interviews with families who lost children and were finally getting answers. The documentary won multiple awards. But more importantly, it inspired the federal government to introduce Isla's Law, a landmark piece of legislation requiring mandatory background checks and audits of private education institutions, full transparency on student transfers and psychological programs, federal protections for student whistleblowers. Across the nation, the ripple effect continued. Other hidden programs were unearthed. Other students came forward, and silence, once protected by polished hallways and brick facades, was now met with public outrage. The final moments of the story returned to where it all began, inside the restored chapel of the old Duskfield grounds. Now preserved as a quiet museum of remembrance, the sun filters through stained glass. The same glass that once glitched in a camera feed the day the twins disappeared. A soft wind rustles the curtain behind the altar. A single candle burns on the stone platform, flickering gently, untouched. Beneath it, engraved into polished wood, "In memory of Isla Rivers. Justice delayed is not justice denied."